In this session, we will discuss Spring Boot. So now in this session, we will start Spring Boot. So what is a Spring Boot? Why Spring Boot is most popular in today? So let's understand one by one. What is a Spring Boot? Actually, Spring Boot is an approach to develop Spring-based application with minimal or less configurations. Before Spring Boot, you have heard about Spring Framework. We have a Spring Framework. Using a Spring Framework, we can develop an applications. But when we are working with Spring Framework, we need to do lot of manual configurations. The big issue with the Spring Framework, we have need to lot of manual configuration. So when we start developing application using Spring Framework, we need to do lot of configuration manually. But Spring Boot come into the market which provide auto configuration. Lot of configuration will provide automatic. As a Spring Boot programmer, you have not required to take care of configurations. Spring Boot will take care of a lot of configuration implicitly. So we can say Spring Boot is not a Spring Boot is not a replacement of Spring Framework. Spring Boot is an approach to develop Spring-based application with minimal or less configurations. So if you want to develop Spring-based application using Spring Boot with minimal or less configuration, then we should go for Spring Boot. So when we should go for Spring Boot, whenever we want to develop Spring-based application with minimal or less configuration, then we should go for Spring Boot. Clear? Now, second point. Spring Boot is not a replacement for Spring Framework. Using Spring Boot, we can develop Spring-based application, but with minimal or less configurations. Spring Boot is a part of Spring Framework only, but it reduces the configuration in the application development. When we develop the application using Spring Framework, we need to do lot of configuration manually. As a programmer, you need to do lot of line of code for configurations. You need to take care for every configuration. But Spring Boot, what provide? Spring Boot provide auto configuration features. So Spring Boot is a part of Spring Framework only, but it reduces configuration in application development. It means if you develop the application using Spring Boot, it reduces configuration in application development. As a Spring Boot programmer, you have not need to take care lot of configuration in application development. Who will take care? Spring Boot will take care. Okay. Now, all Spring Framework module we can use with Spring Boot also. This means whatever modules we are using in Spring Framework, all Spring Framework module we can use also with Spring Boot. So we can say here, Spring Boot is not a replacement of Spring Framework. Spring Boot is an approach to develop Spring-based application with minimal or less configuration. Actually, most of the person thinking whether Spring Framework and Spring Boot both are different things. Spring Framework and Spring Boot both are two different framework. No, a Spring Framework and Spring Boot both are similar framework. But if you want to develop Spring-based application with minimal or less configuration, then we should go for Spring Boot. Spring Boot provides lot of configuration implicitly. As a programmer, you have not need to take care of configuration. As a programmer, you need to take care of only business logic. Spring Boot will take care of lot of configuration. So that's why Spring Boot becomes more popular. Okay, so it means whatever framework we can use, whatever modules we can use in Spring Framework, the same module we can use also within a Spring Boot. Now, what type of application we can develop using Spring Framework? Same type of application can be developed Spring Boot with minimal configuration. So that is the advantage. It means what type of application you can develop using Spring Framework. Similar type application you can develop using Spring Boot, but with minimal configuration. You have not need to take care a lot of configuration. You can reduce the configurations. It means what type application you are developing using Spring Framework, same type of application you can develop using Spring Boot with minimal configuration. So Spring Boot make it easy to create a standalone production grade Spring based application that you can just run. This means Spring Boot provides faster development. Using Spring Boot, we can develop application in faster manner. So, okay. So if we are using Spring Boot for application development, so we no need to spend much time for configuration. If you are using Spring Framework for application development, we need to spend lot of time for only configurations. But it is an advantage in Spring Boot. If you develop similar type application using Spring Boot, we no need to spend much time for configuration. This means we can develop application in a faster manner. So Spring Boot provides a lot of feature to develop application in a faster manner. Because Spring Boot provides auto configuration approach. This is a major advantage of Spring Boot application. Spring Boot framework, Spring Boot provide auto configuration approach. What is auto configurations? Auto configuration means Spring Boot will identify the configuration which is required to run our application, and it will provide that. This means Spring Boot automatic detect. Spring Boot auto detect whatever configuration required, which is required to run our application, and it will provide that. Watch here. So when you develop, suppose any application using Spring Framework, MVC web application, suppose we want to develop. If we want to develop web applications using Spring Framework, we have need to configure lot of jars first of all. Apart from configure this jar, we need to configure the dispatcher servlet. Actually, in Spring MVC web applications, we have required one front controller that is known as dispatcher servlet. So once you added this jar, after that you need to configure which dispatcher, which is a front controller. That front controller we required to configure in a XML file configurations. We need to configure that front controller also. But if you are developing same application using Spring Boot, only one jar you have required. Watch here, only startup web jar required, and it automatic detect. Yes, this is a web application. So it means for the web application we have required front controller, and it will capture that front controller automatic. You have not need to configure. You have not need to tell Spring Boot automatic. I detect and capture that front controller. This is the advantage of Spring Boot if you are developing application using Spring Boot framework. If you are developing any application using a Spring Boot framework, you need to take care only business logic. You have not need to spend so much time on configuration. You need to spend less time on a configuration. That is the advantage of Spring Boot. Now understand the features. What Spring Boot provide the features. Why is Spring Boot more popular? First of all, Spring Boot provides starter form files. This means whatever configuration, whatever dependencies requires. Suppose if you want to develop any web application, okay. If you want to develop web application, before Spring Boot framework, we are developing suppose web application using servlet. Okay, what happened? What you need to do when you want to develop web application? You need to install the server in your local system, Tomcat, and then You need to download the servlet API, servlet jars. You need to create a project. You need to you need to configure the servlet API, servlet jar in your project. You need to set the class path. All these things you have need to take care. But if you are using the Spring Boot provide all the dependencies. Actually, what means of dependencies? Suppose if you want to develop web application, so you are dependent on servlet jar file. Yes, no? Servlet jars. This means you need to include servlet jars in your project. That is the dependencies, we can say. But if you are using Spring Boot provide all the jar in the form of starter forms. Suppose I want to develop Spring Boot application. So Spring web application. So Spring Boot starter web. This is the jar file. Just you need to tell, yes, this dependency we have required. This means all the dependencies Spring Boot provide in the form of starter. Spring Boot starter dot, here we writing asterisk. Asterisk means you can specify whatever in place of asterisk, whatever dependencies you have required. So Spring Boot provide all the dependencies, okay, in the form of starter forms. Where Spring Boot starter forms. Okay, let's watch here and here, watch here. Okay. So now next feature, auto configuration. Second feature is the auto configuration. Auto configuration means it automatically detect whatever configuration required to run our application, and it will provide that. So it means it will guess automatic. It will guess the configurations required to run our application and will do that configuration as per our application requirement. So this is a major advantage of Spring Boot. Third, embedded server. Spring Boot provide embedded server. It means, okay, when you developing web application using servlet, you need to download the Tomcat server explicitly. You need to install that server. But if you are using the Spring Boot provide embedded server facility. You have not need to download. You have not need to install the server. Automatic server it will contains embedded server facility available. So Spring Boot provide embedded server. By default, Tomcat server is available. So this is a third major advantage. It means Spring Boot provide embedded server facility also. Actuators. Spring Boot provides actuators. What is actuators? Actuators actually which monitor your application health. Monitoring means it will check how many application currently, how many instances are running, which service is running or not running. This means whatever health of your application you require to monitor, Spring Boot provide actuator. Using actuator, you can monitor the health of your application. And next, it also provide embedded database support. Suppose if you want to store data into database, you have not need to install the database also explicitly. Spring Boot provide embedded database support also. You can use database directly because Spring Boot provide embedded database supports also. And embedded server supports that already we have discussed. Yes, no? So this is the feature of Spring Boot. What is the feature of the Spring Boot? One by one, Spring Boot provides starter forms. First of all feature, starter forms. It means it will provide all the dependency in the form of starter forms. And second feature is the auto configuration. Is a major advantage, major feature of Spring Boot, auto configuration. What is auto configuration? Anybody have asked in the interview, what is auto configuration? Auto configuration means it automatically detect whatever configuration required to run our application, it will provide that. Okay, so what is auto configuration? Auto configuration means it Spring Boot automatic detect whatever configuration required to run our application, it will provide that. You have not need to take care of. So next advantage, embedded server. Embedded server support available. It means Spring Boot provide embedded server support. You have not need to install the separately server. Spring Boot provide embedded server supports also. Next, Spring Boot provide actuators. Actuators, what is actuators? It means actuators monitor the health of your applications. It will provide embedded database supports also. So it means embedded database supports also. Spring Boot provide embedded database supports also. These are feature will be provided by the Spring Boots. Now next. Now here we understand building first Spring Boot application, how we can build Spring Boot application. Okay, when we can create a Spring Boot application in two ways. One is using Spring Initializer website. Another is using IDs. Actually, to develop Spring Boot based application, we have one website, Spring Initializer website. If you go to the Google and you type this URL spring start.spring.io, okay, this website allow to create Spring Boot application. Okay, I will show you. You can go the browser and type the start.spring.io, and now here Spring Initializer is open. So now you can read this point. What is a Spring Initializer? Initialize generates a Spring Boot project with just what you need to start. Okay, now click here Spring Initializer. So what's here? This is the website, and what is the URL? Start.spring.io. Yes, no, this is a URL, start.spring.io. Now you can check here. This is a Spring Initializer website. Now you can develop your project using this website. You can provide here group ID, artifact ID, and project description, whatever you have required, and you can here add the dependencies. Dependencies means to run our applications, what dependencies, which jars we have required, on which jars we are dependent. The Spring Boot provide all the dependencies in the form of starter forms. So watch here, this is a dependency. You can search from here and you can add those dependencies in your project, whatever dependencies you have required. Okay, so this is the first approach. You can develop, you can create a Spring Boot project using start.spring.io, Spring Initializer website. You can create a project here from here. After that, creating this project, you can download your project in your local system, and then you can import that your project in your ID. Okay, so this is the first approach. You can create a Spring Boot application using Spring Initializer website, or you can create a Spring Boot application using IDs directly. So Spring Boot, to develop a Spring Boot application, we have ID, STS ID. Using STS ID, we can develop directly project. Okay, I will show you. Okay, if we are use ID internally, ID will communicate with start.spring.io website only to create a boot application. Okay, let's understand what's the difference between both them. Okay, if you are creating a Spring Boot application using Spring Initializer, so first of all, you have required to create the project and download this project in your local system, and then you need to open the ID, and after opening the ID, that project you need to import in your ID. Okay, so what you need to do two level tasks. What first, you need to create a project using a Spring Initializer, and you need to download that project in your local system, and then that project you need to import in your ID. But if you are using ID directly, what happen? ID internally will communicate Spring Initializer website. Okay, ID, what does ID internally also communicate with Spring Initializer website to create a Spring Boot application, but it will create directly, it will communicate. Okay, watch here how. Suppose this is my ID and this is a Spring Initializer website. If you are creating a Spring Boot application directly using its ID, so ID, what does internally, it will communicate with Spring Initializer and it will directly create project for you. So which ID we are using? You can use any ID, either Eclipse, STS, IntelliJ IDEA, but which is recommended for Spring Boot? STS ID is recommended for creating Spring Boot applications. Okay, what is a Spring Initializer? What is a Spring Initializer? Spring Initializer is used to create Spring Boot application. Spring Initializer is nothing. It is a website which is used to create Spring Boot application. Okay. If anybody asks in the interview question, what is a Spring Initializer? Initializer is a website which is used to create Spring Boot application. Okay, what is the URL? Start.spring.io. Okay, this is the URL for Spring Initializer website. Okay, when we create a Spring Boot application using Initializer, it will give the application in the form of zip file. Okay, so when we create a Spring Boot application using Initializer, it will give the application in the form of zip file. Okay, when you create this application using this website, and once you download the project, it will provide the project in the form of zip. So it means you need to extract that project and then you need to import that project in your IDE. So we need to extract that zip file and we should import the project into our IDE. Yes, we can create Spring Boot application directly from IDE, but internally IDE will interact with start.spring.io website to create the project. Okay. Apart from this, we can create a Spring Boot application directly from the IDE, but internally IDE will interact with start.spring.io website to create the project. Okay, so we should have important points when you create the Spring Boot application. We should have the internet connection to create a Spring Boot application. Okay, now we understand Spring Boot project structure. Once you create the Spring Boot applications, okay, I will show you here. Already have created this Spring Boot application. Watch here. This is a Spring Boot application I already created. So under this application, watch here. Once you create the application, Spring Boot has one project structure. Watch here. There is under that project we have SRC main Java folder, and then we have SRC main resource folder, and then we have SRC test Java folder. Okay, these are folders are available. Okay, what is the which type folder where we have required to use? Okay, so watch here when you create a Spring Boot application, Spring Boot follows some project structure. So Spring Boot contain one folder src main Java. Src main Java contain one file that is known as main file application.java. Okay, I will show you. This is the main src main Java folder. Okay, I will show you here. Open here. Now open the src main Java folder. Now it will contain one class. Watch here. And now this class what contains? Main method contains. So when you're developing core Java based project, so the class which contain main method, that class is known as main class. That class is known as entry point execution. Yes, no? So Spring Boot also contain one main class which contains the main method public static void main run. Public static void main. Yes, So Spring Boot contains what main class that is known as starter class. Okay. So src main Java, actually src main Java folders what contain, which type files we require to place inside src main Java. Inside this folder, we have required to place all the Java component, whatever Java resource files requires. All the Java component we have required to place inside src main Java folder. Okay, suppose you are developing any service layer. Service layer is means which communicating with, which contains the business logic. All service layer, all DAO layer which communicate the layer which communicating with the database, which contain persistence logic. Service layer, controller layer, POSIO class, all the Java component class we have required to place under src main Java folder. Now next folder we have src main resource folder. Watch here, src main resource folder, and this inside this folder we have one file that is the application.properties file. This is a configuration files. If you require to specify any configuration for your project, you can mention that configuration inside application.properties file. Okay, let's now open this. You can check here under src main Java we have a static folder, template folder, and here we have one file that is the application.properties file. This is a very important file, application.properties file. So any configuration you want to provide for your applications, you can provide, you can mention that configuration inside application.properties file. Which type configuration? Suppose I want to change the port number. Actually, when you run the Spring Boot application running 8080 port number by default. Okay, Spring Boot uses which server? Tomcat server implicitly. I want to change the port number. So where we can write the code, we can write the configuration, such type configuration inside the application.properties file. We will discuss in later on great detail also what application.properties file does. So src main resource files, we will write configuration files here. Configuration file available in the format are .properties, .yml, .xml format. Okay, now next folder we have src test java folder. src test java folder. This is the test files. Here we need to write all the unit test cases. Okay, test code, unit test coding. If you want to write for a pure application testing purpose, you need to place that code inside src/test/java folder. And now when you create a Spring Boot application using Maven, here we have pom.xml file. This is a pom.xml file, and I will show this a pom.xml file. This is a pom.xml file Spring Boot contains. This is a project object model files. Project object model file. Actually, pom.xml file is the heart of the Maven tool. Here we developing the Spring application using which tool? Which building tool? Maven building tool. Maven building tool contains one pom.xml file. So in this pom.xml file, we need to specify all the configuration, all the dependencies, whatever required your project. So what here? Here we have dependency sections. You can see here dependency section. Under this dependency sections, you can specify all the dependencies, whatever you have required. So this is a project structure. Now, when we create a Spring Boot starter project, by default we will get boot start class. Okay, watch here. When you create any Spring Boot application, you go to the src main java folder. Here we will get the boot start class. This is the main boot start class. You can watch here, which contains main method. Spring Boot starter class contains the main method. So Spring Boot application execution will begin from that start class only. Okay, when we create a Spring Boot starter project, by default we will get boot start class. Spring Boot application execution will begin from start class only. So when you run the Spring Boot application execution start from this class. This class is known as a Spring Boot starter class. Okay, from where Spring Boot application is started? The Spring Boot application execution start from the starter class. Which class is known as starter class? The class which contains main method. Okay, so boot starter class contains main method which calls Spring application dot run method. Okay, watch here. When you open this class, this is a Spring Boot starter class which contains main method. Inside the main method, you can check here. Here we have class Spring application dot run method. Spring application is a class and run is a method. Run is a static method which is present in which class? Spring application class. So what is a Spring application? Spring application is a class. Spring application is a class. Spring application is a class. Spring application is a class, and now which contain one method, run method. This is a static method. Now run method take as an input which class you need to run as a starter class. So what here we pass this class act as a starter class for your project. I'm passing that class name and any argument that we want to pass as a command line argument. What here? That argument also we are giving. We want to provide any input at that time of running the application. That input you can also provide. So this is a starter class. So run method contains, run method what contains? Run method contains the logic for to boot your application. So boot class contains main method boot class contain main method which calls Spring application dot run method. Okay. Okay, watch here. So this is a boot class. You can check here Spring Boot. Okay, and which contains run method. Main Spring Boot starter class contains main methods which calls a Spring application dot run method.